the early 1970s, a gentleman called Philippe Zimbardo decided to conduct an experiment. He decided to conduct an experiment to see whether the conditions in American prisons was due to either the sadistic nature of the guards that worked there, or whether it was due to the environment in which the guards were in. In order to determine whether the environment was causing the behaviour, what he did is got 24 volunteers who were students at the time. They were deemed to be physically and mentally stable and not involved in anything like antisocial behaviour or anything like that. He split them evenly into two groups, prisoners and guards, and what started to happen was something pretty interesting. The guards started to take on what was deemed guard-like behaviour, and the prisoners started to take on prisoner-like behaviour. And what I mean by that is the guards started to do things like take any opportunity they could to stamp their authority over the prisoners. And they even went as far as dehumanising the prisoners themselves. And it even got so extreme that at one point a prisoner mentally broke down, at which point a psychologist stepped in and said, you know, we think you should leave the program. And the prisoner's response to this was, I can't leave, I'm a bad prisoner. Effectively saying I needed to be punished, even though he was in an experiment. Now these, at the start of this process, were just to be mentally stable people. Now why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because the environment heavily dictates our behaviour and heavily dictates what we believe is right or wrong to do. And as learning and development professionals and as managers, pretty much one of the things that the only things that we can control to dictate how our employees feel is the environment in which they are working in. Now, myself and Cam, we've talked a lot about learning cultures in the past. It's something we're very passionate about, and we understand that the LPI release recently, it's in the top 5 concerns of learning and development professionals, if not the #1 concern of learning and development professionals. So learning cultures are really important, and I hear a lot of people saying, oh, we need a positive learning we need a learning culture in our organization. And I do have a slight issue with the phrasing of we need a learning culture, because I believe we've all got cultures towards learning in our organization. The question really is the culture we have a good one or a bad one? And are the environments that we have created and are maintaining, are they affecting that culture in a negative or in a positive way? So we're going to do a couple of things today. First of all, we're going to talk to you about why a learning culture is important, particularly in the context of where work is now and where it's heading. And the second thing we're going to do is look at learning cultures in a bit of a micro level. So look at what sort of things can we change, what sort of things can we affect to create a positive learning culture.
Great, so as Dan said, it's important for us to start and look a little bit about the wider context around the future of work. And a lot of that involves a really scary word called automation. So I'm sure there's people out there who have had conversations with each other, with other providers today around automation. And there'll be people who see it as a massive challenge, but there'll also be people who see it as a really great opportunity for themselves and their organizations. So what we've done is we've pulled together some statistics that I think really nicely exemplify the challenge and the opportunity related to automation. So 50% of the knowledge in year 1 of a technical degree is outdated by graduation. So let's just let that sink in for a second. That is a crazy statistic. And I guess what that's saying is that the shelf life of technical skills and technical knowledge is becoming shorter, and there's more of a reliance on being able to find those skills and apply them rather than just recall them at any point that you need to. So secondly, 375 million people will change occupational categories by 2030. I mean, that's a huge number as well, and it's important here to note that occupational category means change job role entirely. So it isn't that a specialist mental health nurse will have to retrain as another type of nurse. It's someone who drives a heavy good vehicle will have to retrain as someone who works in logistics or someone who works in marketing. So there's a massive structural change coming in the global economy. Thirdly, I think this is probably the one that I think is most interesting. So in 60% of jobs, 30% of the activities can be automated. And if we think about that, that means for the majority of people, 30% of time you're going to have in the future doing things that you don't currently do. So there's a huge opportunity there to get people doing things that are using human skills, such as questioning, critical thinking, creativity, and not things that potentially can be done by robots, such as data entry. And finally, 74% of people in the UK currently are ready to learn new skills or to retrain. So as a room full of people who are interested in L&D, that's a brilliant statistic, and that shows that nearly 3/4 of our people actively want to improve their skills and they want to change. So it's our responsibility to look after these people and provide them an opportunity where they can continue to develop themselves personally, but also help us develop as organisations. So I guess to sum up, we've kind of got two options. The first option we call the blockbuster option, and hopefully you don't get sued for this, but essentially what we're saying is that if we do not look at this as an opportunity and don't start to innovate, all our people around us will continue to move and we will stay still. The second option is to see this as a real positive opportunity and sort of attack it full on and see what happens.
So Cam's pretty nicely set the scene there as to why it's important. Now, what is our focus? What are we thinking about? When we're talking about the environment, what are we focusing on? Well, we're focusing on how do our employees feel when they come to work? How do they feel is the right way to behave? How do they feel is the wrong way to behave? And you can tell from Zimbardo's experiment, the environment heavily dictates what people feel is right or wrong to do. Pretty much, the only thing that can be influenced by, the only thing that people feel is right or wrong to do is influenced by the environment. Now, you can split the environment really easily into two areas. Firstly, you've got the physical environment, which is absolutely important, but we've only got 30 minutes, so we're not going to focus on that today. But if it's something you're interested in, we do have research around that. Come up, have a chat with us afterwards, and we'll share some links and stuff with you. Where we really want to focus is what's the mental space that we're putting our employees in. So when we're thinking about that, and when we're thinking about the environment, we're thinking about these areas. So how much time do our employees feel like they have available to them to engage in certain activities? And notice I said how much time do people feel like they have available to them, not how much time do they actually have available to them. What's their mental capacity like? What are the sort of things that is pulling on their attention? Do they have a sense of purpose when they come to work? Has the organisation given them something bigger than themselves to believe in? What are the levels of trust like in the people around them, which directly translates into how safe do they feel in their working environment? What's their overall well-being like? And there's been loads of talk over the years about how important this is, and it absolutely is. And a lot of this sort of feeds into how much willpower do people have when they come into work to engage in positive activities. And a great example of how it sort of feeds in is if you've got low levels of trust in your organisation and people don't feel safe, well, they're going to waste time and energy and willpower on making themselves feel safe in an unsafe environment, and they'll have less willpower to engage in positive activities. And finally, what are the levels of autonomy people feel like they have? Do they feel like they've got permission to choose how they spend their time and what activities they engage in? And as we go on and talk about a few more points, permission will become really important, and you'll see that.
Okay, so let's start where we always start a virtual college, and that is by looking at submarines. So there's a few faces out there that are looking a little bit blank, so please bear with us, and hopefully this kind of will make sense. Just quickly, has anyone heard of David Markey or read the book Turn the Ship Around? So see, there's a few people out there, and to be honest with you, about a month or so ago when Dan and I started looking into this, I'd never heard of David Markey, but he's quickly become one of my favourite people. He's incredibly interesting. So David is American, and as a young child, his ambition was to become the captain of a nuclear submarine. So I think we can all agree it's a pretty cool ambition to have as a kid. So in the US Navy, the culture is very much orders get passed down the line, passed down the chain. You cannot question them. Whatever is said by your superior stands. And essentially, a good manager in that environment is someone who has compliant people below them. So David found out that he was going to take charge of the USS Olympia. And what happens is you get given 12 months before you pick up the keys to your new shiny submarine. And in that 12 months, you have to know the submarine inside out. So you have to know what every button does, what every tube does, what every pipe does, what can potentially go wrong. So fine, David started doing that. The slight issue was that 11 and a half months into this, so 2 weeks before he picks the keys up, he gets a note to say, actually, you're going to take charge of the USS Santa Fe. So there's two slight issues with that. The first issue comes that the Santa Fe is currently the worst performing submarine in the US naval fleet. Not ideal, but David's an ambitious guy, thinks, okay, I can turn this around. The second issue is that the Santa Fe is a completely different submarine. Completely different model. So he spent 11 and a half months learning something inside out, and now it's completely irrelevant. So anyway, David thinks, okay, he's confident in his own abilities, and he takes charge. And 2 weeks into having the keys and out at sea, no one's quite figured out that he doesn't quite understand the submarine yet, until they do some battle-ready drills. And essentially what they do is they shut down the nuclear reactor. And during this drill, it's the engineer's responsibility to try and figure out what's wrong with it and restart it. So David stood there on the bridge, he's got his second in command next to him, and he gives the order forward 2/3, which is a very simple order, apparently, on a nuclear submarine. So the guy in second in command says, okay, shouts forward 2/3, and they look down the submarine, and nothing happens. And David stood there a bit confused, we should be going quicker now. And he turns to the second, and he looks down the submarine, there's a couple of young guys who are sort of shrugging their shoulders and thinking, Captain, there isn't a 2/3 on the dial. So he turns to his second in command and says, did you know that was an incorrect order? And he said, yes, Captain. He said, well, why did you repeat it then? He said, because you told me to. And it was at that point he thought, we've got a big issue here. They've got a crew that's trained for compliance and a captain who doesn't understand the ship. And they've got to go to war soon, which is not ideal. So what did he do? So firstly what he did is he got all the officers together. He sat them down around the table and they put the cards down and basically said, look, I'm going to stop giving orders. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give control and permission out to the crew. And what that does is it creates an intent culture. So by intent culture, it means people go up the chain of command and say, I intend to do X because of Y. So they would come to David and say, Captain, I intend to submerge the submarine because all the men are below deck. We've got our orders. I've done all the relevant safety checks. Are we okay to go? And he would say, yes, that's fine. He gave the crew permission to challenge, which is really, really important. It's something that Dan touched on a little bit earlier. So a direct impact of the permission to challenge was that the Santa Fe was out at sea and they were on a live operation to pick up a US Naval SEAL team. Essentially, they had to be at a specific location at a specific time to extract these guys. So on a nuclear submarine, the captains are always wired into the communication, so he's constantly listening to what's going on the bridge. And he hears an order and thinks that is the incorrect order. So David overrides that order and says, actually, no, we need to do this. At that point, the most inexperienced and the youngest person on the bridge turned around and said, no, Captain, that's incorrect because of X, Y, and Z. And actually, if they'd listened to Marquet at that point, they would have failed the mission. So that just exemplifies quite nicely how important that being able to challenge is in this sort of environment. Interestingly, I mentioned at the start that the Santa Fe was the worst performing submarine in the fleet. When David had finished, he got the highest ever rating in US naval history, which is absolutely crazy. And 9 out of 14 officers on the Santa Fe are now in charge of their own nuclear submarines, against an average of around 2 in the Navy. Again, crazy statistics. So David summed all this up very nicely. He said, essentially, the sum of 134 brains is always better than the sum of one. And it's pretty difficult to argue with that.
So we're at Learning Technologies, and we've just talked to you about submarine. Thanks for not leaving. Why are we doing that? Are we just a little bit mental? Maybe. Well, let's take the submarine slightly out of the equation and think about it for what it is. It's an organization. And David's walked into that organization where he is essentially the CEO. Now, it's a very hierarchical organization where absolutely you do not challenge the person above you, and the person above you knows more than you. The second thing about that organization is it's failing. And when David walks in, it's solely his responsibility to turn that organization around. Now, we're probably all familiar with failing organizations. Cam mentioned Blockbuster earlier, or potentially failing departments or sections of organizations. So I've got a quick question for you guys, and hopefully you can shout out afterwards. So just for 30 seconds, have a quick chat with the person next to you. What do you think the typical business response is to a failing department or failing section of the organization? So we'll give you 30, 20 seconds, and then if a couple of people could be brave enough to shout out, that would be great. Okay. Okay, cool. Have we got anyone that's happy to throw some ideas our way? Volunteer?
Please.
Yeah. Anyone? Review and sack people? Yeah, absolutely. Any others? Okay. Well, review and sack people is on our list, so thanks. We've not obviously not put all the responses up there, but we've put some interesting ones up there. First of all, and as L&D, I'm sure we've heard this plenty of times, let's get people in a classroom. There's a problem, let's get them in a classroom, or let's give them a course, and that will solve the problem in our organization. Let's potentially reshuffle the department. Something's not right with the people in that part of the organization, so let's give it a bit of a reshuffle. Or at worst, that kind of thought process can absolutely lead to the people in that part of our organization are incapable. Therefore, we'll get rid of them. Or the department as a whole is a cost, so let's get rid of the department itself. Interestingly, David didn't have those choices available to him. And the interesting thing is the Santa Fe was the worst performer, and it had the same people in it when it became the best performer. So he didn't get rid of people, he didn't do any of that stuff. So let's look at what he actually did. So the first thing he did was put his trust in people. And trust is a really powerful thing. Firstly, when you put your trust in people, it can make them feel valuable. Also, David was a massive believer that people on the front line, people with access to the most information, are the right people to be making the decisions. And that's really important too. Now, what trust can do is it breeds more trust. It engenders trust not only back in leadership, but also in the people around you. And I believe trust is a really fundamental part of a learning culture. A really good way to think about it is, I think for a learning culture to be successful, you need an environment that's pretty open and honest, where people can share ideas. And I think we've all pretty much accepted that we learn the most from our mistakes, and you can learn a hell of a lot from other people's mistakes as well. But if you've got an environment of low trust, do you think people are very likely to share their mistakes with each other? Well, probably not, because they probably feel pretty vulnerable. So trust is really important. Permission is another thing that he did, and permission has had a pretty big impact on me in my working life. If you'd met me 3 years ago and said, Dan, do you feel comfortable looking at a TED Talk or reading an article whilst you're at work? I'd probably say no. And if my manager or CEO had walked past at that point in time, I'd probably have felt like I was doing the wrong thing, and like maybe I might get in trouble for doing that kind of thing. Now, that absolutely does not mean that my manager or my CEO would have thought that was the wrong kind of behavior. What it means is that at that point in time, I didn't feel like I had permission to engage in those kind of development activities. Another thing he did with permission was enable people to think about how things currently are and challenge the status quo if they didn't think that they were right. Challenge how things were actually done and take some action. And that's really powerful, because by being able to challenge, you enable innovation to take place. If you don't have an environment where challenging is okay, you don't have an environment that enables you to breed new ideas, essentially. And if you think about the Santa Fe, with a little bit of innovation, went from the worst performer in its industry, effectively, to the best performer. Well, that's pretty impressive. And what does it say about the other submarines in that industry? Well, actually, probably they weren't performing at their best, and if anything, they might have been underperformers. So the rigid structures that were in place in those organizations were preventing them from being better performers. Now, we think permission is really important, and we've been working with a fantastic neuroscientist, a lady called Amy Brand. She's here today as well, and she sent a short clip across to us on permission. So we're going to share a bit of neuroscience with you. It's not too bad, though, so yeah, hope you enjoy. Audio? She's mentioning something about cortisol right now, which is really interesting, I assure you.
Not working?
No?
No.
Okay.
Oh, let's pretend that was interesting.
Yeah, let's pretend that worked fantastically and all of that was really good and you're all really impressed. That'd be great.
Anyway, thanks, Amy.
So permission's important. Another thing that's really important is enabling people to understand the purpose, enabling people to understand the mission of the organization itself. And this is something David did really well. And on the face of it, purpose, mission, they sound like more cultural things, not necessarily learning culture things. Well, firstly, I believe that culture and learning culture are heavily intertwined, and if you separate them out, you're probably setting yourself up for fail. But secondly, let me ask you a quick question. How do you think people are able to train themselves in the right way, develop themselves in the right way, think about the right things? If they don't know where the organization is heading, how do they know that they're developing themselves to match up their future selves with the future organization that they're potentially in? I'm a massive believer in self-directed learning, but I also believe people need some semblance of knowledge on where the organization is heading to make sure they're developing themselves in the right way as well. So I think understanding the mission and purpose is really important too. So David made a number of probably relatively small but incredibly brave changes. So that brings us on to us. What sort of small but brave changes might we be able to make?
Yes, Dan was completely correct at the start when he said we can't simply create a positive learning culture. But hopefully it's kind of become a bit clearer throughout what we've been talking about, is that the environment that people are in when they come to work is something that we can absolutely influence. And again, by environment, we mean, how do people feel? So do they feel supported? Do they feel happy? Do they feel challenged? So what can we actually do? I mean, to begin with, the first one seems pretty obvious, but I think it's something that we very often neglect. So understand how people currently feel and currently think. I mean, I think often as people in learning development, but as humans in general, we are guilty of thinking that we know what someone is thinking without actually asking them. And I mean, I've certainly been involved in learning interventions, and I'm sure people out there have as well, but we're going on the manager's perception of the problem and not actually the problem itself, because we've not spoken to the end user. We did something similar at Virtual College actually about a year or so ago, where we got people together and we had some really open and honest discussions around how people feel when they come into work. And this was all anonymous. And essentially we asked them some really simple questions. How do you feel when to come into work? Do you feel supported? Are you happy? If you were in a position of power, what would you change? We got some really, really interesting sort of data and ideas back from that. And it's something that we've been starting to implement internally sort of over the past 12 months. And it is really starting to have a positive impact upon the environment and the culture where we work. So secondly, is the concept of low-stakes islands. And this is something that we have taken from a TED Talk by a guy called Eduardo Bricino. It's a really great TED Talk, and he focuses on what he calls the learning zone versus the performance zone. Essentially, kind of to sum it up very succinctly in 30 seconds, the performance zone is that zone at work that we're in. So 80% of the time we're in the performance zone. It is a high-stakes environment. We don't necessarily want to fail. There's risk. We don't want to try new things. We just do what we've always done. If you think about it from a sporting perspective, if you look at a professional footballer, for example, 80 to 90% of their time they're in the learning zone. So they are training, they are practicing, they are honing their skills, and they only take that into the performance zone on a Saturday when they're really confident that they can deliver it. Now, what we're saying is that if we can create that environment internally, it can have a real positive impact. I mean, how often do we have a new salesperson joins a business, and within the first 2 weeks, they're out pitching in front of a client and demoing the content? It's the first time they've ever done it, and they're out in front of the client, sink or swim. Don't have an opportunity to find what makes it tick for them. They don't get to see Dan do it and think, I like what he's doing there, I don't like what he's doing here, and kind of mold their own way. So if we can create that environment where we've got a culture of trust, an open culture where people are willing to fail in that safe environment and give feedback and share ideas, it's going to have a real positive impact on the business.
Another thing we can do is support people to become more curious. And curiosity is something I've heard a lot about recently. I know people are speaking about it today. And I've heard a lot of leaders in industry, CEOs, leaders in the L&D world talking about, we need more curious people. We need to hire curious people. And I've always had a niggling question in the back of my mind, well, how do we facilitate people to be more curious? I can't walk up to someone and go, Dave, tomorrow, could you be a bit more curious, please? It doesn't really work like that. And I think we've all been through this same system of education where we're told what to learn, when to learn, and how to learn it. And, if you're the kid at the back of the class, this might or may not have been me, but you're staring out the window, looking at a cloud, thinking, how the bloody hell does a cloud work? Why is it up in the sky like that? And you turn around and you ask your teacher, and you're in a maths lesson, well, you get told off, and you get disciplined. And that spark of curiosity gets quashed because, unfortunately, clouds aren't on the syllabus today. So we've all gone through this same sort of system and process, and now we're in the world of work, and some people might be naturally very curious, and some people might be less curious. So how do we support them and facilitate that? Well, I think there's two main approaches. The first one I like to call the QI approach, and yes, I am talking about the TV show for anyone that's seen it. What QI do is, it's an interesting thing. They share facts with people through entertainment that's probably interesting to about 90% of people. And I've definitely sat there and gone, oh, that's really interesting. And I've jumped on Wikipedia or I've jumped on Google and gone on to find out more because that curiosity has been sparked up inside me and enabled me to go on and learn. And that's absolutely something we can do in our organizations. We can think about what might be interesting to 90% of our people and share it and see if we can get any of those sparks going in our own organizations. There's a second approach we can take, and I think this is probably much more effective but much more difficult, is to genuinely understand what interests every person in your organization Now already you're probably thinking that's an impossible task, and it's absolutely something L&D can't do alone. We have a fantastic tool out there. It's called management. Doesn't always do what we want it to do, but sometimes it does. And if you can get your managers to be genuinely interested in what interests their people, then what they can start to do is think about what's interesting them and build on those interests. That's how curiosity works. It builds on stuff that you're already interested in. Effectively, what we're trying to do is something very similar to the YouTube algorithm. You know, so you're sitting on YouTube, it figures out what you're interested in, and it pops something in front of you that it knows you're likely to click on. So that's what we're trying to do, and I'm sure we've all been there sort of at 3 a.m. in the morning on YouTube, wondering quite how we've got to 3 a.m. and not too sure how it's all works. So we're trying to recreate that same thing in our workforces, but in a much more controlled and hopefully much more productive way. Another thing we need to think about is, how are our people measured? What KPIs do we set? How do we incentivize people? How are they managed? Because if all of your KPIs and all of your incentives are short-term performance-focused things, and you're ignoring all the long-term behavior stuff, well, the message that the business is sending to the individuals is that these things, these short-term performance things over here, they're important. Self-development, learning, all of that kind of stuff, not so important to us. And it should be no surprise to us when those kind of self-development activities falls to the bottom of people's priority list. Now, you can get all of that in place, you can have the right KPIs there, but if your managers aren't behind it, then it doesn't really work, because what will become apparent to people pretty quickly, if all the managers are speaking about is performance and the bottom line, well, people will be like, okay, these KPIs over here that are performance focused, they're the ones that really matter. And these soft measurements over here, no one really cares, so I'm going to ignore these. And again, self-development starts to fall to the bottom of their list. So that's absolutely something you need to look at. And managers are really key in this. Managers need to embody the right behavior. They're the people that need to be brought into this first of all, and they absolutely need to lead by example too. And it's got to come from the top down. It can't come from the middle. So if your leadership team aren't embodying the right behaviors, you absolutely cannot expect middle management to be embodying them either. So management's really key. I guess the way I like to think about this all is, it's not one big event, you know, it's not a silver bullet that just solves all of the problems. You can't just have an away day on learning or culture and suddenly everything's going to change and it'll be all right. The way I like to think about it is, what we're trying to do is create enough small nudges in the environment so that the behavior change reaches so that the nudges all come together to reach a point of critical mass, and the behavior change starts to become inevitable and just snowball, so that when people are in your organization, they'll feel and they'll know what is the right way to behave and what people in the organization should be interested in, and that learning and development is key. And when new people join, again, they'll see that learning and self-development are key behaviors that you need to get on in that organization. So I hope we've given you plenty to think about in terms of your environments at work, and I hope you can go back and consider the environments you have and are currently maintaining. Are they helping you generate a positive learning culture, or perhaps are they leading to a more negative learning culture? And both myself and Cam, we firmly believe that if you can influence your environments to enable you to start to generate a more positive learning culture, then you can build much more sustainable and stable organizations that are built for the future of work and where work is heading. So thanks a lot for listening to us. If you've got any questions, we'll be up here, so come and have a chat with us, and we're also just on that stand there.